The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. This is a routine stop, he stammered, but the growing unease in his tone betrayed him. The woman didn't flinch, her confidence only seeming to grow. Routine, you say, she replied, her voice dripping with subtle irony. The agents exchanged glances, their demeanor suggesting they knew more than they were letting on. The officer, now visibly nervous, started to realize this situation was far bigger than he'd anticipated. But why were these people here? And what was their connection to the woman? The officer's unease turned to panic as one of the agents pulled out a badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "You just stopped a federal judge," the agent said coldly. The crowd erupted in whispers, their phones capturing the officer's stunned expression. His face flushed with shock as he looked back at the woman, who now stood with an undeniable air of authority. "A judge," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped closer, her calm demeanor now sharpened by a quiet intensity. "Yes," she said, her tone unwavering. "And not just any judge. I oversee cases involving police misconduct." The officer's mouth fell open, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. But just as he started to stutter an apology, the agent spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension. "What's more concerning," he said, "is that this interaction is now evidence in an ongoing investigation." The officer froze, his eyes darting between the agents and the crowd. The woman leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "Respect is not optional, no matter who you think someone is." She turned to leave, the agents following closely behind, leaving the officer to face the judgment of the watching crowd. As the SUV pulled away, the officer realized his career and reputation might never recover. But what no one noticed was the small, knowing smile that crossed the woman's face as she disappeared down the street. As the SUV disappeared into the distance, the crowd lingered, murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others expressed admiration for the woman's calm strength. The officer, now alone by the roadside, stood frozen, his face a mixture of shame and regret. The weight of his actions, and the consequences they would bring, hung heavily in the air. For those watching, the moment served as a powerful reminder that assumptions can lead to dangerous mistakes. The woman's grace under pressure and her unwavering confidence left an indelible mark on everyone there. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or retaliate. Her presence and the truth she carried had been enough to turn the tide. As the crowd dispersed, one bystander, still recording on their phone, muttered, "She didn't just teach him a lesson, she taught us all." And with that, the street fell quiet again, but the impact of what had unfolded would be remembered for a long time to come. It started like any other day on a quiet suburban street, until things took a troubling turn. A black woman, dressed in a sharp business suit, was pulled over by an officer who clearly assumed the worst. From the moment she rolled down her window, his tone was harsh, his questions loaded with judgment. She stayed calm, trying to de-escalate the situation, but his condescending remarks only grew louder. Passers-by began to notice, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort. Who was this woman? And why was she being treated this way? As the officer continued to humiliate her, dismissing her calm explanations, she finally decided to reveal something about herself that would change everything. His smug confidence began to falter, and the look on his face told the entire story. What she said next left him speechless, and the crowd stunned. The officer's initial confidence began to waver as the woman spoke calmly, but firmly, her words laced with a quiet authority. She explained she was on her way to an important meeting, but he cut her off, accusing her of being evasive. The tension in the air was palpable as onlookers whispered among themselves, their curiosity growing. Who was this woman, and why did she seem so composed despite the officer's escalating behavior? She reached for her bag to retrieve her ID, but the officer, clearly on edge, warned her to move slowly. The crowd gasped, sensing the fragile balance of the moment. When she finally handed over her credentials, The officer glanced at them briefly before his expression changed. His eyes darted back to her, then to the ID in disbelief. The crowd grew quieter, straining to catch a hint of what had just shifted. What had he discovered? Backslash. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he held her ID, his jaw tightening. He glanced back at the woman, his tone now noticeably quieter but still strained. "What's this supposed to mean?" he asked, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. The woman didn't flinch. "It means," she replied, locking eyes with him, "you might want to think carefully about what you do next." The crowd exchanged curious looks, murmurs growing louder. A young man filming on his phone whispered to his friend, "She must be someone important." Another bystander muttered, "He doesn't seem so sure of himself now." Meanwhile, the officer's mind raced. He had assumed she was just another driver to intimidate, but now something wasn't adding up. Why did her credentials look so official? And why did her calm confidence seem so unshakable? The longer he stood there, the more the weight of his mistake began to settle in. Yet, he wasn't ready to back down, not yet. The officer's face turned pale as he stared at the ID in his hand. He glanced back at the woman, who remained calm and composed, her eyes steady and unwavering. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their curiosity now mixed with tension. He shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing that all eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do next. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The woman hesitated for a moment before opening the door and stepping out with quiet dignity. She stood tall, her presence commanding. The officer's confidence faltered further as he noticed her bearing, the way she carried herself with authority and grace. As she took a step closer, the officer's radio crackled to life. A name was mentioned, a name that matched the one on her ID. The officer froze, his eyes widening. The murmurs from the crowd turned into audible gasps. It was clear now that this wasn't just any woman, but who was she really? And why did her identity seem to strike such fear and confusion in him? The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the moment teetering on the edge of revelation. The officer's hand hovered over his radio as the woman crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze cutting through the tension. "You've made quite the scene," she said, her voice steady. "Are you sure you know who you're dealing with?" Her words hung in the air, daring him to answer. The crowd edged closer, their phones capturing every moment, sensing that something big was about to happen. Before he could respond, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the scene. The doors opened, and two sharply dressed individuals stepped out, their expressions unreadable. They exchanged a quick nod with the woman before turning their attention to the officer. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked, their voice calm but firm.